My neuropsychologist once again reminded me about how cultural differences and cultural nuances can impact the way that we view trauma, especially childhood trauma or trauma that impacted us like long ago. And what I mean is, so I'm Jamaican. I'm Diedre. I live in France currently. I grew up in Jamaica, born and raised, moved to France twice. In fact, I moved abroad 5 times and I've lived on about 4 different continents so far. And it's been 17 years living abroad, right? And I had a session. I was talking to my neuropsychologist. Um, and I had to fill out like a self assessment, like this survey, etc., about stuff. And we were talking and we were going through the survey and we were going through things. And they said, my neuropsychologist was like, "Oh, I see that you have some childhood trauma." And I was like, "Huh? Childhood trauma? Donde? Where? Like, where did I have childhood trauma?" Because in my head, right, it's, I've had a childhood that was filled with love, um, surrounded with love. My parents was like very accepting of who I was, even if they didn't really like understand what was going on in my wonderful brain here. They still accepted it in terms of like, well, if it brings Deidre joy, if it's not hurting anyone, it's not a nuisance, then it's fine. Let her be, let her do as she pleases, right? And so this is my childhood as far as that I remembered. And then to have my neuropsychologist be like, "Yeah, I see you indicated some childhood trauma." And I was like, "Oh, my parents would never." And I was like, "Where? Eh? Where?" And then my neuropsychologist said, "Yeah, because you indicated that for some of your punishments, you were beaten with a belt." And I was like, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." And I was like, "We, I'm in France, so of course this is really considered childhood trauma." Whereas, and it indeed is childhood trauma. Being beaten by a belt can be trauma inducing, right? And I think, but in Jamaica, this is something that we're getting much better at it, and it's much the views around beating with bells and stuff like this have largely like evolved towards the positive, right? Where we understand this is not like a great thing. But when I was growing up 40 years ago, it was quite normalized, and it's still relatively normalized in Jamaica, but it was even more so normalized. And then also add to the fact that I did not receive, rarely did this happen. And it never happened after the latest was like age 8, 7, 8 or something. Even from like 6 or like, yeah, 8. Never ever after this, right? And even before then, it was like maybe, I don't know, if I can count 10 times, if I can count 5 times, it's a lot. But indeed, I have been beaten with a belt by my parents. And so when my neuropsychologist pointed it out, I was like, it was really, really shocking to me because, like, Deidre, why would you say, where did you tick a box about childhood trauma? And it just had me thinking about how cultural differences impact the way that we view things. Because it is indeed trauma inducing to beat your child with a belt or anything. This can be quite traumatic, right? Because it is a relative act of violence. However, since while growing up with my parents and in their venture and their efforts to be the best parents that they can be, they also learned and realized that this is not something that they should be doing, and they realized that they actually don't agree with the idea behind it, and that it's something that they want to fix within our family. And so this really stopped really quite early. This was something that was stopped, and it was also something that was discussed with us. So I just grew up knowing that, this was corrected behavior. It was acknowledged. It was, really, they held accountability for my parents, held themselves accountable for it. And like other solutions were put in place for punishments or helping us, me and my siblings, to understand and learn what consequences are if we don't follow the rules, or if we break something, or if we make a mistake. Like, this was discussed and like acknowledged in my family. So I was really, really shocked, right? And then the funny part is that when I said, ah, oui, en France, c'est trauma. Like, yes, yes, in France, this is trauma. My psychologist was like, and I was like, but in Jamaica, it's not. My neuropsychologist, it was their turn to be like, huh? Because for them, this is clearly traumatic, and this is not something that you quite do. This is not something that is done. And it just had me thinking about the different ways of how cultural differences and cultural nuances can really impact how you grow up, what you identify with, how you view trauma, and how it impacts you in your life as you go on as an adult, or even like as you grow up. Because for me, this was, and perhaps it was because my parents had already like addressed it, acknowledged it, held themselves accountable for it, and we, put other things in place. Perhaps this was a big played, I'm sure it did play a part, but perhaps it played an even bigger part than I knew. But just thinking about how normalized growing up, especially when you're growing up in Jamaica, how normalized this was, um where you could get beaten in school, parents, the neighbors, other family members, um and it was just not viewed as traumatic. And so for me, excuse me, I had completely forgotten this part, and I didn't even really remember that I ticked that yes, I have in my childhood at some point received punishment by being beaten with a belt. And also just me kind of like, I don't want to say dismissing it, but it really, I felt like minimize the effects about this. So my reaction wasn't like big, or it was just kind of like matter of like, yes. For both cases, the fact that this is something that is relatively normalized in Jamaica, and like I said, they are getting better with it. And most schools have stopped this. It's been years now, but just thinking about it really had me like, oh, look at that. Because had I been raised in France, immediately my impression would have been, this is a traumatic experience. And I think my reaction, or the way that I remember it, or the way that I held it in my body, in my memory, in my brain, etc., would have been, would have had more of a negative impact on me, even if my parents did what they did and they acknowledged it, um held accountability and for themselves, and moved and made efforts to like improve on this and stop it, and to put other things in place. Like, even if that happened in France, well, what if I grew up in France, I think it still would have had like a bigger impact. And it just made me think about how many things are we dismissing, minimizing, and perhaps to our good fortune, I don't know if this is the word, but perhaps to our fortune, that we are able to like minimize, like not have take a big deal, or not consider it a big deal, or internalize it. Yeah, I think this is the word. Not internalize it as deeply as we would, should, could. I don't know what the word is here. if we grew up under different cultural context and different cultural environment. And, you know, I had to like pause when I was talking to my neuropsychologist, the same way that I'm pausing now, because I had to like really think back to realize that once again, the way that you live and your perspective of life and how things are or how things should be is only one way. It's just one way of thinking. And there's so many other ways of living your life. And it also just had me going back to perhaps if I had a different um neuropsychologist, or perhaps if I had a neuropsychologist in a different country, we would not have this conversation, or I wouldn't have had the reaction of like, huh? What do you mean this is not childhood trauma? Of course, this is a traumatic experience. Perhaps it would be something else, right? And just having been able, I think, to travel and to explore and to see different cultures and to see how people in different cultures view things, internalize things, categorize things, navigate things, um negative experiences, traumatic experiences, even the positive ones as well, how each culture views things differently can like really impact the way that you live your life. And it just, I don't know, I just had to pause and think about it. Like for you, how, having traveled, are is there anything in your life where you're able to view it differently and have a different point of view about something in your life because you traveled and you saw it done differently, or you saw the reaction or the interpretation of it was different, much different from yours and the culture that you grew up? Tell me in the comments if there's anything that like really shocked you. Because for me, yeah, just talking to my neuropsych, I was just like, yeah, indeed. You know, hmm, indeed. This, like, I haven't, like, I knew, I think theoretically, abstractly in my brain, I knew it is a trauma inducing experience. And I think also because, like I said, we had already worked through it as a family. We're quite transparent about it and what our values are and how we view it, that I was able to process it and deal with it. But let's say I hadn't done all of that. Just I, I'm just imagining how shocked I would have been if we hadn't like discussed it and I grew up normalized with even more normalized that punishing by beating with a belt is the standard normal thing to do. Imagine how shocked I would have been in my discussions in my session with my neuropsychologist when we were going through that and just popped up like, oh yeah, you have childhood trauma. And just like, what are you saying? Vous parlez de quoi, monsieur? You know, like, vous parlez de quoi? Like, what are you talking about? Just, I don't know, like, I was just thinking about it. And I came to just ask you, have you encountered something like this where your cultural way of doing something is just so different from a culture that you encountered while you were traveling, or if you're living abroad, the new country, the foreign country that you're living in, if it's just different and what it is? I was just quite curious to know. What else is like really, I mean, there are tons of like everyday things that are obviously different from in France than how a Jamaican would do things, right? Like the way you set your table, how you start meetings, how you conduct meetings at work. Mm, bah, well, like the fact that I'm saying bah, this is very French. And like this is not typical Jamaican sound. So these are like things that I've absorbed because I've been relatively immersed and integrated in French everyday life. But just had me thinking about it, and also had me really grateful and finding myself feeling quite privileged to have had the experience and the opportunities to travel so many times. I've gone to about 27 countries now so far solo, and a lot of them I've repeated. Like I've traveled to multiple times. I've spent quite a lot of time in different places with cultures way different from mine, and I've been able to like observe um different ways of living. I have friends from acquaintances, multicultural, like totally different from just Jamaican culture. And just having that opportunity and that privilege of being able to travel and being able to create such an international space and an international life and point up and having like perspectives or multicultural perspectives injected into my life is such a huge privilege. And I hope that that you will take the opportunity to travel and to travel slowly and to immerse yourself and to connect with people with different cultures from yours in order to expand your world, because that's what happens. You become expansive and the world around you just expands, and it shifts in so many different ways that you're able to grow and you're able to like hold different perspectives at the same time, and you're able to like analyze them and look at them objectively, and then also end up combining and creating something for yourself, right? Because you're able to say, this part here might be something that I want to inject and also adopt and also use and incorporate into my life, because it matches better with my core values. It matches better with how I want to live my life. This new cultural way of doing something matches better than the way my own culture tells me I should be doing it or I should be doing it, right? And I hope that you're able to do that. And I want you to be able to see the opportunities of traveling and also of moving abroad and living in a space, or even when you're home, to intentionally go and find multicultural things to do, things that are different from the way that you know how to do the thing. And I hope that you take the time to observe. Like this is your weekend. This is your project. Next week your project. I hope this is the project and something that you will do so that you can experience a more expansive way of living and have a evolve and have a bigger world. Speaking of bigger worlds, it reminded me of, so I moved to France twice, right? It reminded me of something when I moved back to Jamaica. So I moved to France twice. And each time I've spent so far about 5 years on each trip moving to France. The first time I moved back from France, I did quite a bit of traveling, etc., and I ended up moving back to Jamaica. And I was working, etc. And we were talking about religion, right, and spirituality and these of things. And so Jamaica is quite a Christian country. Like Christianity is quite embedded into the culture for many things in many aspects. And for me, I'm less Christian, right? And or yeah, I'm not as dogmatically religious as others would be. And so anyways, the conversation we're talking about something about religion, etc. And one person, one of my colleagues, my coworkers at the time, they mentioned something like Christianity is needed to be able to, like have morals and etc. And like to be able to understand what's good and what's bad and what's right from what's wrong, etc. And so I said, well, yes, it does help. And that can be a base of it. But the point of morality and the different aspects of morality doesn't really have anything to do with Christianity itself. There are overlaps, there are things that they have in common, but you don't need to be a Christian to be moral or to understand, basic humanity, the humanity of things. And they were just like stumped of like, well, what do you mean? No, you need Christianity. Like they couldn't see beyond that. And part of it, which we also discussed as well, was because they did not travel a lot, right? I don't think they were able to travel outside of Jamaica at the time. And so I said, well, no, like, for example, I live in France and France is a secular country. They practice laicity, which means that, religion is a personal preference, etc. And if we look at the violence rate in France and in Jamaica, there's a huge difference. Jamaica is largely Christian, majority predominantly Christian, and France is not, but the violence rate is different, where France is less violent, much safer than Jamaica is. And there are there are tons of other reasons and factors for this, right? That which is beyond the point, and we also talked about it when I was discussing with my coworker at the time, which is like, yes, we know that there are other factors, but it's if you separate at just the morality of things, a Christian country should not be as violent. You would expect, or you would think, you would imagine that a predominantly Christian country with a part which, according to my colleague, you need Christian values in order to be moral and to understand right from wrong, good and bad, etc. etc. You would expect there to be less violence, like it would not be so high. And you would imagine, on this basis, you'd imagine France to be more violent, right? I'm like, yeah, tons of other European countries which are even less Christian than France is. You can even go to other, countries that practice different religions. And, it's not, they practice different religions as opposed to Christianity, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, just different religions. And they're also not as violent as Jamaica is, right? For example. And the colleague, he was like, well, Diedre, your world is much bigger than mine. And I was like, exactly, exactly. This was like, exactly, like, please stay on this point, stay on this point. My world is bigger than yours. And it's not a brag, and I wasn't like, I'm not trying to like get bragging rights, but it just means that because of this, I was able to have, because I traveled, because I ended up because I chose to live in other places, because I curated a life that was multicultural, and I intentionally tried to see things from different cultural points of views. I was able to have different reference points. And so I was able to say, well, no. Yes, okay, we grew up in Jamaica thinking that yes, you need Christian values in order to be moral. I am generalizing and simplifying many things. But yeah, okay, I grew up with this sort of like ideology or this sort of like thinking. But then I was able to travel and I was able to see different ways. I'm like, oh, well, these people aren't Christian and they're just as moral as anybody else that I know in Jamaica. Those people, they don't even believe, like, they're not even like religious. They're just as moral as anybody else in Jamaica. These people come, practice a completely different religion and have a completely different religious system of belief. And they're also just as moral as, anybody else in Jamaica. And so I had like different points of views. And I could also, which expanded my thinking of, well, okay, well then the common denominator is not Christianity. Like morality and morals is not hinged upon Christianity. Of course, there are tons of overlap, tons of similarity, and for sure, if you follow Christian beliefs, you will end up practicing and having a lot of morals and in your belief system. Of course, it does definitely support it, but it's not the only way, and it's not, and morality is not hinged upon it. And if you don't have Christianity, you're going to lack immorality. No, no, no. Which my colleague, they had not, they did not have these modes of reference. And so for them, morality was way more hinged upon Christian values than anything else because they didn't have a point of reference and they hadn't thought about thinking about like, well, different places don't practice these things. Sometimes they didn't even know what other countries were practicing, right? And again, I also had that conversation, and having had that conversation, they were also able to shift their views just a tiny bit, like a seed was planted. And they were like, oh yes, because Deidre, your world is actually bigger than mine. And so you're able to like extrapolate and think a bit wider and broader than me, which is, like really great self-awareness. And so we were able to also have um a much more interesting and dynamic conversation and discussion around those things. And they eventually ended up starting traveling as well, and so that was also like pretty fun. Maybe I'll put like a pat on my back, like, hey, maybe I influenced it a little bit. I would like to think that, but this is just me probably thinking a little bit too much of myself. But I say all of that to say that, what was I saying? Yeah, the point is that traveling can expand your world in so many different ways that I really hope that you imbibe and like build in multiculturality. Multiculturality? I think that's a word. Build that in a little bit more into your life in a more intentional way because it really does you way more good that I don't know what negatives there are that it will bring you. Having thinking about things from an international point of view or a multicultural point of view, being able to have different points of reference only brings more growth and it helps you to evolve and expand and brings more richness into your life. And I hope that's something that you take away from this discussion. And my session with my neuropsychologist really just I'm burping, excuse me. My session with my neuropsychologist really, reminded me once again that cultural nuances and having different cultural points of view, it really shows you how your way of thinking is only one way. It's not the way. It's not necessarily the right way or the wrong way or whatever. It's just one way. Sometimes it is the wrong way, just it is. But things that you take for granted, uh, as in this is the way that it should be or this is the way that it is, so many of our thoughts, it's really not. It's just our way. This is just one way this is. It's one way that things could be. And I really hope that you take some time. If you're thinking about moving abroad, do the thing. If you want to move to France, move to France. I have my monthly workshop about moving to France, FYI. where we talk about all of the essentials of what you need and understanding your first 3 months of moving and what all the things that you need, the essentials. Or you can have my one-on-one sessions. Of course, if you have like particular questions or you have like scenarios that are very specific to your situation, come talk to me. We can talk about it. If you're moving abroad, do it. If you want to take on more travel, do it. Go to places that speak different languages from you. Go to places that practice different religions than you. Go to places that have different environmental, like the geography of the place is different from yours. The landscape is different. All of that will impact and show you how living life differently is, yeah, it can be quite cultural. It is cultural. And some of the things that you're thinking about, it ain't it. It's not the way, it's only one way. I just had to thank my neuropsychologist for that thought. And I came here to just talk about it because I was curious to know for you, what are some of the cultural newness, cultural things that you learned through your travels that was like, this is much different from mine. And is there any like cultural thing that you picked up from a foreign country? What are they and how do you incorporate it in your life? I'm Diedre. I help women to move abroad, to live a life that they love, the life that they desire, because they deserve it, because you deserve it. See you at the next one. Ciao.